Deftones have been around for 28 years as a signed band, which is why they may very well be considered a veteran metal band. And it's no secret that most veteran metal bands reach a creative peak in their career at some point, which they usually cannot overcome late into their career. There are plenty of bands which release that breakout debut album that catapults them into superstardom, and in many cases that first album remains their best work. But there are other bands that manage to have a more long-lasting career by releasing several critically acclaimed records, but still, usually their creativity and relevance eventually evaporate. Deftones fall under the second category of bands, as they are one of those bands that kept their core audience engaged for the longest time. But even they broke a streak of practically perfect records with their 8th studio album titled Gore, which recently turned 6 years old. And this is the album I will be talking about today in my new series, What Went Wrong, where I talk about records that didn't quite work. Deftones had an interesting career, and unlike quite a few other bands, their first release, Adrenaline, was not exactly a breakthrough record. In fact, I would say their first two releases obviously left some room for the band to grow. This is probably why Deftones had such a fruitful and long-lasting career. Among their peers, Deftones have remained most relevant, innovative, and interesting act to follow. They managed to break away from the new metal bubble with White Pony, which is by many considered to be their best effort to date. Even though at the time not everyone understood the importance of this record, in the long run, White Pony became one of the most influential alt-metal albums of the past 20 years. Their follow-up self-titled release was very much a natural continuation in their discography, which did not lack in creativity or experimentation. In 2006, Saturday Night Wrist came out and was by many considered to be the first hiccup in the band's discography. The band itself considers Saturday Night Wrist to be their most disjointed effort, as the band was not on very good terms between each other and with their record label. Most of the material was written via internet, where each band member worked on their part individually. This was a significantly different process, as the band usually wrote together while jamming in their rehearsal space. I personally, however, consider Saturday Night Wrist to be one of the best efforts by the band, as I feel like it encapsulates everything that makes Deftones special. The record is diverse, dark, moody, and gets heavy when it needs to be. It also spawned quite a few fan-favorite tracks. However, for the majority who did not appreciate Saturday Night Wrist, Diamond Eyes became a sort of redemption record. At first, without the original bassist Chi Cheng, it took on a heavier guitar sound, which very much fell in line with the rising popularity of Gent in 2010. At the time of its release, I enjoyed Diamond Eyes quite a bit, but I must say that I barely get back to this record, because it sounds rather monotonous. But I must admit that You've Seen the Butcher and This Place is Death are very much undeniable top-tier Deftones songs. In 2012, No Yokan was released and became their most critically acclaimed record at the time. Fans also praised this release. It was a more balanced record in comparison to Diamond Eyes in terms of guitar work, as not every track relied on the down-tuned guitar sound. It's a very rare occurrence when a band 7 albums deep releases some of their finest work. This is where the band's longevity and influence is very much evident. So, naturally, the expectation for their next release was very high. Even though the critics' score was only second to No Yokan, the majority of Deftones fans were disappointed. Of course, tastes and opinions will be just that, but if you follow any of the fan websites, Reddit, or Deftones Facebook groups, Gore usually ends up at the bottom of the list. The most common issue people usually find with Gore is that it has a lack of guitar-driven, or should I say Steph-driven songs, which is actually not far from truth. I believe that to any seasoned Deftones fan, it will be very obvious that most of the writing on this record was obviously done by Chino. As a guitarist, songwriter and vocalist, Chino had the most influence on this record. Besides, Steph's comments on the making of Gore are very much a proof of the fact that Steph was not as involved into the writing process as he perhaps should have been. I think my proudest thing about my guitar playing on this record is just playing on the record, because I didn't want to play on the record to begin with. But in a later interview, he elaborated that this comment was generally about one song, Hearts, Wires, which he struggled with the most. But once the recording was done, this song actually became one of his favorites on the record. Also, Phantom Bride was written completely by Steph, apart from drums and vocals. Chino mentioned that in his opinion, Phantom Bride is the best song on the record, and specified that some of his favorite Deftones tracks overall are actually the ones that Steph spearheads. So the rumors that Steph and Chino were not on good terms creatively speaking can be laid to rest. Even though there has always been some tension between the two, it's a kind of tension that fueled their creativity and dynamic writing for decades at this point. Steph also said that it took him 8 records before he had any kind of issue with an album, but he already lived through 2 records in the past where somebody else didn't enjoy them at all. This is actually a major point in this case, as it's practically impossible for each band member to enjoy every record, especially when other members also have strong characters. So, in many ways, Steph was quite lucky to have lasted for such a long time before he finally hit a wall with the record. Chino also said that when the record was complete, Steph did apologize for not being as engaged into the writing process as he should have been, which Chino took with understanding, but did admit that the record may have suffered in certain areas because of lack of Steph's involvement, and I believe it's especially apparent because of the lack of heavier material on the record. But can one really say that Gore is a bad record? Well, once again, just as with any art form, this is mostly a subjective matter. I personally struggle to call it a bad record overall, but it's a weak record in comparison to the rest of the band's discography. But you gotta keep in mind that few bands have as strong of a track record as Deftones have. Beginning of Gore is quite promising in all honesty, but each time I try to get through the entire record, I find myself drifting off or skipping songs about halfway through the album, and I have given it quite a few listens too, but even 6 years later it fails to capture my attention, unlike their other releases. Gore is perhaps a little lackluster. The overall feel of the record is just not as dark as Deftones fans are used to. It still sounds like Deftones and has that melancholic atmosphere, but in most cases it is overtaken by choruses or other sections that are inspired by the lighter side of the band's sound, which has been a part of their repertoire for the longest time, but never to this extent. It's common for bands to become less aggressive over time, and Deftones is no exception. For example, the intro to Pittura Infamante does not sound like it belongs on a Deftones record. Even the heavier parts of the record are overwhelmed by the amount of melodic elements on this release. To me, the dissonance of Deftones' sound has always been one of core elements and appeals of the band. So naturally, I was still hoping for something darker in anticipation of Gore's release. But I guess it wasn't meant to be. Another apparent weakness I find with this album is its mixing, which I find quite strange. On several tracks, the drums are simply drowning in the background to the point where you can't really tell what Abe is playing, while the down-tuned guitar is taking center stage, in some cases even overtaking the vocals, which seem to take a back seat on several tracks with that combination of distant echo and reverb effects. The overall sound of the record seems to be on the more ambient side, leaving a lot of empty space in terms of soundscape. I know that overcompression is a big problem in modern metal, but I feel like the lack of compression on all the instruments apart from some guitar tracks, is hurting the overall sound of the record. Because of this, the impact of heavier tracks such as Doomed User is just not quite on par with their previous releases. The delivery of aggressive vocals is also not as impactful as it once was. Chino's parts overall are not as experimental and creative. His vocal melodies in most cases lack that hook factor. Throughout the record, vocals are just there. So I guess they are doing the job they are supposed to, which is unusual for Deftones, considering that in previous records, Chino is more often than not very much at the very center, driving and elevating each track to its fullest potential. On this record, the best written vocal melody, at least to my ear, is the chorus of the single Prayers Triangles. To me, this is the only memorable vocal melody on the entire record. To summarize, despite the fact that Gore is my least favorite record and probably the least favorite record among many Deftones fans, Deftones are far from being washed up. They wanted to try new things with Gore, and they did. And even if it didn't quite come together, Deftones did it their own way. Instead of chasing some trends of rock and metal music of 2016, Deftones have always followed their own path. This is why I will probably always have a lot of respect for this band. This was an interesting video to make because the very first video on this channel was made when Gore was released. The video, however, was not about Gore but was about Chino's vocals. And the second reason is that I started making this video and did most of the voiceover for it a year ago. And I do say a couple times in the video that Gore is 6 years old when it's actually 7 years old at this point. And I do apologize for the absence of new content on this channel for such a long time, but life happens and it was really hard for me to find the time to make content that was up to my standard. But I will be releasing content on more frequent basis moving forward. And by the way, I did just release my very first vocal cover on Deftones here on this channel, and I would really appreciate it if you checked it out. As always, drop a like, leave your thoughts in the comment section below on Gore and your most and least favorite record by Deftones. Subscribe if you are new to this channel and this kind of content is your cup of tea. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one. Take care.